a boiling pot, some judgment, and the fall of Tyre, all today on another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're going through Ezekiel chapter 24, 25, 26, and 27. And tomorrow we're going to go through 28 through 31. So let's get it started. All right, so there's our boiling pot. We have it. This is the parable of the boiling pot. Now, verse 1 and 2 says, "The word of the Lord came to me in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month. Son of man, write down today's date. This very day, the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem, this very day." Now, the date of this prophecy is very significant. This was the day that Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem began in January of 588 BC. Later in Israel's history, the date became an appointed fast day and was observed as early as the time of the prophet Zechariah, as we'll see in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19. This was the day that Ezekiel had been pointing to for more than 4 years. The date was so significant, in fact, that it was also mentioned by the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings in 2nd Kings chapter 5, verse 1, and also by the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 39, verse 1, and 52, verse 4. So, those left in Jerusalem here were like the choice meat, as it said here, intended for the pot, as opposed to the discarded byproducts that represented the people taken away into exile. This parable is not very reassuring at all. The visuals here of the pot glowing so hot was not good. Thus, the pieces of meat here in verse 5 were probably pictured Jerusalem's inhabitants who would be boiled in the judgment fire of Nebuchadnezzar's siege. In verse 6, this corrosion they talk about, that represents injustice and blood guilt. And of course, in verses 15 and 16, it says the statement, "Take the delight of your eyes away from you." This is reminiscent of God's command to Abraham, actually in Genesis 22, to offer his son as a sacrifice. But his wife here is going to pass away. She is going to die a sudden death. Now, when it says sudden death, it doesn't really say exactly how she died, but it could refer to combat or from a plague or a disease or something that happens very quickly. It's a very quick, sudden death. But no mourning was allowed for him. He was not allowed to mourn. And it went through all the different common ways that people would mourn, and God saying to him, "Do not do this." And then in chapter 24, verses 18 through 21, Ezekiel's behavior was kind of peculiar to the people who were around him. And it was so unusual, in fact, that the people asked him to explain his own behavior. And he does, but it was, of course, at this point where he becomes mute. The prophecy which says that a fugitive arriving from fallen Jerusalem will mark the end of Ezekiel's silence is fulfilled later on here in chapter 33, verses 21 and 22, that we're going to read about in a couple days. So hang around for that. Ezekiel's ability to speak again will signal that his 6-year ministry of announcing judgment will be over. But a new ministry starts, and that will be the ministry of consolation. So he's going to be consoling them as his next ministry starts. So we get into chapter 25. Now, this section here starts a section that goes all the way through chapter 32, verse 32. And this section of Ezekiel pretty much bridges the book's message of doom and its message of hope together. Doom for Israel's antagonist spells hope for Israel itself. The placement of these oracles at this point, though, it kind of disrupts the flow of the book, and it heightens the tension as the destruction of the temple is imminent. But here we are flipping over to judgment against these nations, as opposed to finishing out and actually seeing the destruction happen. So God's judgment on these nations is based on the Abrahamic covenant, which said that those who cursed Israel would be cursed by God. That was in Genesis chapter 12, if you're looking for that. All the nations named in the oracle had either taken part in Jerusalem's destruction or they had rejoiced over it. The audience for these oracles was Judean, so they had cause for future hope. Now, they were done in a specific order here. Ammon, Moab, and Edom are all mentioned in the order of their geographic location from north to south. So they start at the north and work their way down. The Ammonites, of course, were descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot, and they were known for idolatry, cruelty, and pride in their opposition to God's people. Moab, those Moabites, they were descendants of Lot and one of his daughters as well, and they were known for introducing Israel to Baal worship, which was a bad thing. Edom and the Edomites, this was, they were descendants of Esau, that he was the father of the Edomites. And the most blatant example of Edom's opposition to the people of God was Edom's role in the destruction of Jerusalem's temple. So that's going to bring us up to the Philistines, and of course, we know a lot about the Philistines. So we get to chapter 26, and this is going to get us to the fall of Tyre, the downfall of Tyre. Now, the Phoenicians here, they represented the remnants of the original population that occupied Canaan before the Israelites arrived. Well, as the most powerful city on the Phoenician coast, Tyre dominated not only other coastal cities, but much of the Phoenician inland area as well. Tyre's Hebrew name means rock, so built atop an island off of the Phoenician coast, Tyre was virtually impregnable by sea or land. Relations between Israel and Tyre were often pretty cordial. If you remember in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 7, Tyre was the preeminent maritime power of the ancient world. They joined Judah in revolt against the Babylonian Empire in Jeremiah chapter 27. Now, after Nebuchadnezzar defeated Jerusalem, he also besieged Tyre as well. And he besieged them for 13 years. He sat there and he laid siege to this town of Tyre for 13 years. But he was unsuccessful in his campaign. Even though he had wiped out all these other towns and cities and countries, and he could not beat Tyre. He was unsuccessful to conquer their offshore rock fortress. So, what happened to Tyre? How did this biblical prophecy come true that Tyre would fall? Yes, it did. But it didn't happen until about 332 BC-ish, when Alexander built a causeway of stone. It was stone, timber, and rubble, about a half a mile long and over 200 feet wide, from the mainland to the island. By this way, Tyre was finally conquered, thus fulfilling Ezekiel's prophecy in chapter 27, verse 36. That's what I had for you today. So here we got a picture of what Tyre looked like at around 332 BC, and then a picture of what it looks like today. Well, on your left, you'll see that picture from 332 BC. You'll notice that if you reference the picture to the right, it looks like half of the island is underwater. Well, that's actually the case. Most of the island is washed away. And during this period between 332 BC-ish and a little bit before, what had happened is a lot of silt and sand had blown up, rolled up in between the actual land and the island, that separation area there, and that afforded it to be a very shallow area of water. So how did Alexander do this? Well, here Alexander was on the right, and this is his army. Of course, Tyre's on this island on the left. So what he decides to do is he starts building land, basically chunking rocks and driving poles in the ground and basically building a land bridge is what he's doing. And he's gradually moving it over. And as he builds up his army, he's building up this land as he goes. His navy's getting bigger and bigger. He's bringing all of his forces in to take over this teeny tiny little island of Tyre. And as he does, he finally gets there to Tyre. And of course, they're all blocked in right here. So Tyre had a little navy there, but they were nothing compared to Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, compared to Alexander, not Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't do it. Alexander. And once Alexander got to the walls and started banging down the walls, all the rubble that fell, he used that rubble to solidify this land bridge that he was building. So most of the land bridge was built by stuff that he had brought from the mainland, but he also used like the raw rubble from the walls that he knocked down to reinforce it, to be able to bring even more troops and stuff over to Tyre to finally defeat it. And there we have it, where his final attack and how he finally besieged Tyre. And today, Tyre is actually located in the country of Lebanon. And there it is. This is what Tyre looks like today from a Google Maps perspective. So there's a little history there from Tyre. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button, the subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow. And also, click that little boxing glove if you're rumbling with me on Rumble. Give me a rumble there. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. See you then.